Today I'm going to talk about another way I evaluate CS:GO teams. This one's not quite as complete as like the Dota 2 notation one because there's still elements within the team I'm not actually sure matter as much as I think they currently do, or there are elements I'm not sure about yet if I want to add them. But basically, the idea behind this particular way of thought is that's basically like Voltron, where you get a bunch of different pieces and then they fit together to make a robot, right? And then what happens is you basically need to get a bunch of different elements within the team. And then what are the elements I think you need? You need basically experience, potential, skill, teamwork, aggressive play, passive play, a tactical style or a loose style, and then a star. You always need a star player, and that's basically how you mold the team. So when we're talking about this kind of system, it's actually based very much upon the circumstances you have. So basically, it's the current players you have, the star player you want to build around, how much money the current like org has, and then like what are the possible players you can buy out, what are the possible players you can recruit, stuff like this, right? So generally speaking, you want a balance of some of all of these elements, and what I mean by that is you want like a little bit of everything, or a very like strong balance between them all. So for instance, I feel like Astralis right now is probably the most balanced team in the world in these elements. So for instance, they have a bunch of experienced players, but they have one potential superstar player in Kirby. And basically, the reason you want like a mix between experienced players and a potential player is the experienced players will always give a shortcut to the young up and coming like potential player. So the veterans will teach this guy how you play the game, how you prepare for matches, how you prepare your scheduling, how you use like how you go about your daily life in order to like maximize your performance on the day of, how to deal with teammates, stuff like this. And this is all stuff that is very hard for like a young and up and coming player to figure out on their own. And it's like one of the reasons why Moses thinks, and I agree with him, that like NA has always had like a huge like gap year, where basically a bunch of these young and up and coming players have to like relearn everything the hard way because there's nobody out there that can teach them within the team system because all of the old veterans have retired, right? So that's one element. The other element is the aggressive play and the passive play, and in that particular team, Astralis, you have two aggressive elements. You have Kirby and Glaive, and then you have two passive elements, Zipnix and Dupree, and then you have Device, who can go between the two depending upon what the team needs, and he's always very smart and calculated about it. So, uh, between like those five elements, you basically have like a 2.5 split, like 2.5/2.5 between the five different players, right? So a very it's a very good way of working about it. Whereas but it's not necessarily like the best way to do it. What I mean by that is it's entirely dependent upon the players. So, if for instance, if you have too many aggressive players, then you really shouldn't be playing this kind of balanced aggressive and passive style. So, for instance, the current SK has way too many aggressive players. There's basically three of them: Phelps for Fallen, and then Coldzera, and then Taco are like the more passive type players. But in that case, you have to like go much more towards like the aggressive end of the scale, and that will make you a better team rather than trying to balance it out between the two as Astralis has done, right? And then the one below that is generally directed towards like the leader, which is a tactical system or a loose system. So this is also based off of your teammates and your teammates' mentalities. So for instance, I feel like Danish teams in general, like their mentality is you need to have like this tactical, like structured style, and we've seen like some Danish players like leave that tactical structured style and then like look a lot worse. Az, for example, when he went to, when he left for like I think it was G2 or was it Kingwin at the time, the team that eventually became FaZe, basically, and he looked a lot worse, right? Whereas you throw somebody like Dennis in there, he just looks fine. He's just like, oh, this is awesome. I'll just kill everybody, whatever. Or any of the old Fnatic players, or I guess the current Fnatic players, Crims, Flusha, Olaf, Dennis, JW, all of them can play a very loose style, and they're all like fine with it. And it's actually not only are they fine with it, they technically excel in this loose style, but their problem is that particular Fnatic lineup is they've gone way too far into the loose style where even though it worked at the end of 2016, that was also because their like skill was off the charts, especially Olaf Meister, who was like the clear best player in the world, right? And without a clear top 5 player in the world or a clear like top 10 player in the world in the current roster, it's like very hard to like run that style. Like actually no, you absolutely, in order to like run a loose style as that, you actually have to have like a top 5 player for sure, because so basically they don't have a top 5 player. Like the top 5 currently: Fur, coldzera, Device, Nico, Kenny S. Like Olaf Meister doesn't crack it. He's like a very good player right now. He's getting closer to his level, but he doesn't crack that top 5 because you need that type of level of player in order to run a loose style, because a loose style is dependent upon your firepower. And that's the reason that old Fnatic could work and this one could not work. And that's why this current one is actually adding a bunch of like structured elements to the team with more executes, more defaults, stuff like this, right? But it's not going like completely the tactical route, both because I believe it's not because the players don't want to do it, and because I don't think it's very viable it's very viable because the thing about these the current Fnatic players is they're all like great individual playmakers in their own right, and they're all great at playing teamwork. Basically, they're very great at making, if like one of them makes a play, the other 4 players know how to play off that play, and so that's why they're a very hard team to play. And this is actually why like SK already figured them out. Basically, it's like you just deny them the first play, and then they don't really have an answer. So that's kind of, it's like, it's unfortunate for Fnatic because there's actually a clear like kind of limit to how far they can go, but they're still a very dangerous like dark horse team in the current era. So I feel like as a team, this will be like their team's future will always be based around how good the 5 players are, basically. So that's kind of like two different styles, is the tactical styles and the loose style. And then there is the skill and teamwork, and I always feel like you have to have skill in CSGO. I don't know if it's the same in the previous iterations of Counter-Strike. It doesn't seem like it based off of what I've heard or what I've read. But in the current iteration of CSGO, you actually do have to have some amount of skill because of the way the economy works, because of the way pistols are overpowered, because of the way grenades work. So you have to have grenades work where like positioning is now weaker. So you have to have some amount of skill in your team, and the amount of like teamwork you have or like supportive elements around that skill is pretty critical. But on the other hand, you can't. Basically, you will always need like one skilled player. And then you'll have like a balance after that based off of what you can get, right? And then there are also like players. How do I explain this? Okay, I'll give 2 examples. 2 of the best players in the world I've seen have been coldzera and Nico, and I feel they're like complete opposites in terms of the way they approach the teamwork side of the equation, where like both of them are very skilled players, but the difference between Nico and coldzera is that coldzera plays off of his team and can facilitate his team, whereas both inside and outside the game, coldzera is able to do this, whereas like Simple's like he's still too immature to do that right now. He's still too aggressive, still a bit too emotional. So that's like an element to his play where if he could fix it, he'd actually he'd like ascend his game even further than it already is as an individual and as a team player. So that's kind of what I mean when you're looking at the balance between skill and teamwork, because for whatever reason, the more skilled players generally have a worse mindset when it comes to team play. That's not always the case. They're like even less skilled players don't really have the greatest mindset when it comes to teamwork or team play. Like so it's very dependent upon like the player, right? Or the and then how that player works into the system. So for instance, if you did get something like Simple, you do need an element of like teamwork outside of the game that can like work with him, and that was in teamwork, but that was Hiko. And in Navi, I'm guessing it's probably going to be somebody like Seized who's doing that, right? Even though that Navi's in tatters, but I feel like the reason that Navi is in tatters is because they just don't have a like good in-game leader, like a truly dedicated one, somebody who's made it their craft forever, and like who can stop that team from making like stupid individual mistakes a bunch of the times, right? So this is generally like one of the ways I evaluate teams, and it's actually pretty good if you're trying to figure out what the hell is wrong with a current team. Like I'll give some examples for like Cloud9. So for instance, like on the surface, it seems like they have a good balance between aggressive players and passive players, but it doesn't take into account the fact that Shroud, Nothing, Skadoodle's skill level has fallen down. So if they were like still good, like players, maybe this could have gone farther, but they basically like tapped out of their potential. And the only question here is, in terms of like tactical and loose style, they basically like run the loose style to the ground where it's pretty clear there's nothing left they can go with from there. And so at this point, you need a player or a leader that can like harness whatever like I basically like harness the harness the playmaking of Skadoodle, I guess. Like, and that's why a lot of people are considering FNS to be the guy, because FNS has proven multiple times he can lead a team with a opera that needs direction, and Skadoodle is an opera that needs direction. And basically, by incorporating somebody like FNS into the equation, what's happening is you're like changing the elements a bit. So like the current element is like very loose, and then he'll add a tactical element, you'll add a teamwork element, and then you might add like a skill element to as well if he's able to activate Skadoodle. Or you can go like a different way where this can't happen anymore, but if you got somebody like Stewie, Skadoodle, not Stewie, Automatic, Mixwell, Rush, Stanislaw, that would have been a very good team as well. Because what would happen in that team is you get three guy, you actually add three more aggressive like semi-aggressive elements into the team, like Stanislaw, Rush, Mixwell, and then you'd have like a very strong entry duo in Stewie, TK, and Rush, and then like the other three players would immediately be able to swarm the site and run people down, so the T side is set, and then Mixwell is like a very like independent opera who can also rifle, and then you have like Rush and Stanislaw who could play like the supportive elements on the end, so that would have also added a tactical element, but it would have added more aggression to like the mix rather than like the passive play of the potential like Skadoodle like FNS combo, right? And then it also adds like more potential to the team, because what's happening with the FNS, if you input in FNS, is like there's not much potential left in him as a player, whereas I feel like Rush and Mixwell still have room. Rush, Mixwell, Stanislaw all have room to grow, but there's also this is also like a flaw within the system, is the fact that as leaders, I'm not actually sure that Stanislaw is better than FNS, just in terms of like putting down the structure of the team and like creating a cohesive whole, because I feel like FNS has already proven to me that he can do it with like lesser players, and that's harder to do with lesser players, so I feel like FNS is probably better in that respect. And then like let's go with another fucked up team right now. Okay, North. And what the current iteration in North is basically the entire problem, I guess, is Magus as a player skill wise has fallen down, and they've like changed a bunch of his roles, so he's no longer. So it's getting to a weird point where I'm not actually sure if they consider him a star of the team anymore, because like they basically changed all of his like CT a majority of his CT roles, and like the only one that's been the same has been like Overpass. And when this team was at its best, I always felt like what would happen was Magus would be very good on the CT side, and he had a config take over the T side, and then like between the two of them, they could beat most teams, right? I felt like that was like their answer, so to speak. But the current iteration feels more like they're trying to get AZ, I guess, more priority, and AZ as a player hasn't Like he's fine in like a 3 or 4 position because he's giving you a 3 or 4 performance. But if you're moving him, but if he's actually been moved to like the 2 or 1, so to speak, like in terms of just priority, he actually isn't performing that well then, relative to his role. And even if you ignore the fact about his role, he actually lacks the teamwork element, or I guess, yeah, he lacks specific roles that Rubino played better, and that's kind of like the current problem is they lack a truly great supportive type player, and the only one that is currently on that's currently out there is Rubino. So like is Rubino, but they let him go, so it's kind of that's obviously like a problem. And then the other problem obviously is Config and Magus. Neither of them have both of them have like potential, and that in that sense is very good for the team. But the other problem is neither of them are like true superstars yet. And Magus has fallen off, and Config's very style, like his super aggressive aim heavy style is not very good. It's not very conducive in creating like a superstar level player. Like he's great as your 2, because as your 2 he's just gonna take over the games. He's basically like a fucking hammer, like on Cat. Even in like the current iteration where he's like not taking map control with MSL, even if you just put him on a lurk as like MSL's done, and as like a star lurk player, he can make individual plays and take over entire sites by himself. Like he's done that multiple times at Cash. It's basically their like go-to plays, like Config go kill everybody at B. It's like, yeah, I got it. It's like, what? That's not a play. That's not a tactic, but it works, so it's fine, right? So I feel like Config is a very good player, but he's not. But his very like style won't give you a superstar player. So, and they've like basically like changed priority. So Magus, it doesn't feel like they're giving him harder roles, but it doesn't feel like they believe he's a superstar anymore. Or maybe it might actually just be the case where they want him to like learn more about the game by changing the rules. I'm not actually sure what exactly is going on, but it's not working basically. And in the Danish scene, I don't actually think there's anybody necessarily better. But you might want. There's not anybody necessarily better. What I'd probably do is if you're going for like a Danish player, probably remove like AZ for Valde, because I feel like something needs to change. And Valde's on the market, he's like one of the better players. And then from there, you're gonna have to like jury rig a new system. But I think that's like the best chance they can get if they can't get Rubito back, right? Another fucked up team. Actually, not a fucked up team, but like I'll compare two different iterations. We have let's talk about old Maus and new Maus, because I feel like this is like a funny sort of topic. So new Maus, who do we have? We have Chris J, Ropes, Oscar, Lowell, and Dennis. And new Maus is actually a pretty good team for like the tier they're running in. And the reason they are is because they have the star player and Oscar, who's I probably call him the superstar player of this team. Like I feel he's like the clear like best player on this team, even though like people talk about the new teamwork on the team, like, oh, everybody's better than before. They were better than before. But Oscar is clearly the star of the team. He's the guy who's putting up the most numbers. He's the guy who's giving you the most impact. He's the guy you want to play around, right? And then in terms of like the mentalities of the team, like this is another element you could add, I guess, is the mentality of the team is much better. And the reason for that is a bunch of players that had bad mentalities were removed. Like they're gone. Like two of the 3 are gone. Like Nex and Spitty are gone, and in the place you have like a potential like up-and-comer. In Ropes you have like a veteran in like Chris J, so to speak. Even though he's like taking up the leadership role, he's actually still giving good impact. But like the tactics aren't necessarily like awe-inspiring. They're just like pretty straightforward stuff. And then you have Lowell, who I think has been a pretty good player, and especially in like like he's a solid player. He's helping out the team. He's not necessarily like what I consider a star, but he's not bad either. So I put him. If it was me, I'd probably give him like a 3 or 4 role within the team. Whereas like you're not like a pure support player, but you're not a pure star either. It's like maybe a hybrid, so to speak. And then you want to compare that to the old Maus. You have Nico, Chris J, Nex, Speedy, Dennis. And here's the problem with this current iteration. I'm gonna have to explain a bit as to the current problem because this elements thing is also like kind of connected to my other system, which is like the Dota 2 notation, where basically I explain explain role based off of how much priority they get and off of the performance they give. So for instance, let's go to the new Maus. So Oscar is the one, like in terms of priority he's given. He's also giving you one performance though, so that's great. Who's the two? I feel like two is probably going to be Ropes because he's like the potential new star, and you want this guy to figure out how he wants to play. But in terms of performance, he's currently giving you like a 3 or a 4-ish, and that's actually, you would usually consider this a problem. But here's the things, like there's a bunch of like circumstances surrounding Ropes where like you can't really judge him too harshly based off of this fact because this is his first team. He's young. He just went straight from FBL into playing a bunch of the best players and teams in the world. So I don't, and these are his first lands, so I don't blame him. And I feel like you have to give this guy way more time compared to other players or on other teams. So even though you want him in your 2 role, you can't really expect him to give you like a 2 or 1 performance as you would hope for from other teams that are playing like this role. 3, I think he'd probably give it to Lowell. I feel like he's generally a solid player. Actually, yeah, either Lowell or Chris J, I guess. But I feel like Chris J's taking a back seat because he's decided the leadership role, and he's gone from like his best weapon, which is the op, to becoming a secondary op. And like his rifles are fine. They're fine for somebody who is the main opper. So this kind of works out for them because basically Lowell is always going to generally giving you pretty good performances, and so is Chris J. Even though I think Chris J would probably be a better 3, but like given the leadership situation and given like the fact that Oscar is the main op, you can't really go that way. And then Dennis is clearly the 5, and he's giving you the 5 performance. So it's not really as like he's not. If you were gonna upgrade somebody, he's actually the clear person to upgrade because I feel like there are better supportive type elements out there that you could get into the team. Somebody like Freiberg would probably give you like you give him the 5 position, so to speak, but he'd give you like a 3 or a 4 in terms of performance, and that's like a clear upgrade, right? And the reason I talked about I like broke down all of Maus using that system is because here's the old Maus. Here's the one with Nico. Nico is the one, he's giving you like a 1 like every single time. And who's the 2 on the team? The 2 on this team was supposed to be Nex. And what performance was Nex giving you? Nex was giving you like a 5 or 6 performance. That's like a huge drop off. Like it's not that Nex was bad, so to speak. He's only bad when it counted. And when it counted was the tier 1 tournaments, and that's when he went like missing, like completely gone. I have no clue where he went. Like I don't know why anybody ever believed in him. Like maybe his time under Godby will help him become better. I'm not sure, but during that iteration, I don't think he was a very good player. The 3 on that team was Chris J, and actually Chris J gave you a 3. Like he wasn't he wasn't consistent, but he would always like he was like the only person in that team that like Nico could probably count on in order to give a good performance. All right, and then who were the 4 and 5 of that team? It was Dennis and Speedy. And the problem with Dennis and Speedy is you basically had 2 6 players. No, you actually had a 4 and 5 player who were getting 6 performances. Like it was really, really bad. And the problem with this is basically you have Nico giving you 1 performance, Chris J giving you a 3 performance, and 3 players giving you like dead weight or almost dead weight. It was actually terrible. And that's actually why I've always found it strange that everybody's like trying to say Nico was a problem, because no, Nico was clearly not the problem. And even though Nico had that team, he still somehow almost beat Fnatic single-handedly in overtime against that Fnatic that won 6 tournaments in a row. Like that was fucking crazy. And the heights of that team, even though I consider the new roster will probably eventually be better, the heights that Nico did were still have yet to be surpassed by the current new Maus roster, so to speak. And that's kind of what the hell happened? What was I talking about? So basically, I was like, that's kind of how you would sum up those teams in terms of just the old system I was using. Not the old system, but like one of the other system I used. But in the current system, what's happening is basically the reason New Mouse is better is just because the fucking skills like skyrocketed. Like Lowell was better. Lowell was better than Speedy. Ropes is better than Nex. Chris J is still Chris J, and then like Oscar isn't as good as Nico, but he doesn't have to be. He's still very good for his for his range, and Dennis has improved a little bit, basically, and this is actually more in regards to like the what I call like the mental element. Was basically I feel like everybody on that team, the old Mouse team, understood that Nico in terms of skill, in terms of potential, in terms of a player. This wasn't a guy that should have ever been stuck in the tier 2. It just happened he was because he was from Bosnia, and so he had no other recourse. And because the other I guess I'll exclude Chris J because I feel like Chris J did his job. I guess what happened with the other 3 players, like they kind of realized this, and then it just got into their heads because like they didn't want to disappoint him because Nico was trying so hard, he was so good, and like that, like it's not like he was toxic. It was like they would just like feel down on themselves because they like fail this guy and be like, man, I keep failing this guy. I don't want to fail him, and that just kind of like creating this like endless cycle of pain and like failure, I guess, so to speak. So basically, when Nico moves out of the team, like everybody's much happier, and the reason everybody's much happier is like, yeah, Oscar is good, but he isn't Nico good. Like Nico is like a once in a generation type player, so it feels like it feels like for like somebody like Dennis or like Speedy before he was kicked, like those guys, and those guys were basically like, okay, it's a bit better now because they don't feel like they're so much they don't feel so much pressure to perform because they don't want to fail like Nico. Whereas like even though like they might fail, Oscar doesn't feel as bad because Oscar isn't like a once in a generation kind of talent. Maybe I'm not exactly sure because you'd have to be in the team to figure out how much like Nico's very existence like kind of fucked up the team aspect, so to speak. But that's kind of like a strange element that's actually been improved, as well as like the skill and the teamwork and stuff like this. So those are my current thoughts about like basically like using a bunch of like different attributes and like try to balance them out and then see how like they combine. It's not very well formulated yet, but it's pretty interesting to think about, especially because this is the way you're trying to break down new rosters, so to speak, or like rosters that have been unplayed but have like potential on paper. Is what I've used for like the current a bunch of like new iterations like super teams that like came about within the last 6 months. All right, see ya.